Maybe a small group in here, but evidently there should be some good online participation. You are getting a bunch of people asking for like. Okay.
It's another one. I really don't know.
This is why Franco fled to Grenoble.
Yeah, it's just like I'm not dealing with this one. Yeah. Can we ask Meri how to pronounce her last name? Nobody knows. Can we talk? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
You hear me? Hi.
Hi.
I'm happy to hear you.
So, I don't even know what I'm just looking at your picture on the screen. I don't know what.
That's fine.
Oh, no. Communicate with the Zoom people, it's just that camera approach.
Just up front.
But
Oh, okay.
this is for the web stream,
Oh, okay.
so you're fine.
Okay.
So,
Meri, you pronounce your first name Meri?
Yeah, Mary's fine.
Okay. And how do you pronounce your last name?
Last name is Davlasheridze.
Davlasheridze. Just
I
like
think
you
I can
write
do
it.
that.
Yeah,
Okay.
just like I write it. Yes, it's not as difficult
Between
as
you and me, this is the seminar of impossible last names.
There's,
Yeah.
yeah, about your last name.
Mine
I'm
is
not-
worse
I'm
than
not
Mary's.
getting-
Again.
Yeah.
It's amazing. So thank you again for.
Thanks for inviting. It's a great pleasure.
I'm looking forward to it.
Me too.
so I'm doing the last check.
Okay. Yeah, it's only 3:59. You got me. Do you have a count for how many people are online?
Online, I'll check. So the RSVP record shows there can be almost 40 people, just online.
That's great.
And
Right now, there's
around
12
10
people watching on video.
Okay. And Malgosia, how long do you think you'll be speaking for?
Probably about 45 minutes.
Okay.
So is that okay?
Yes.
I mean, I can cut it shorter, but
No.
I think we were shooting to be about 45 minutes each. Does it
Okay.
run at the full 2 hours? Or
If it runs a
Usually
little
not.
less than the full 2 hours, that's usually okay.
okay.
But yeah.
So then it'll just depend on how many questions.
How many questions
there
there
are,
are.
I guess. And there are, yeah.
So will 45 minutes be including the questions or it's the presentation?
So, usually we have brief questions. So like after Malgosia, we have brief questions, and then we
Okay.
have more of a full discussion with the whole group.
Okay.
So if you need 45 minutes, you got it.
No, I think I'll finish it before 45 minutes. I'm just, yeah. I
Yeah,
think-
often there are good questions, and Ziwan does a great job of getting them from the web.
trying to connect one. I don't know why.
All right, so it's just 4 o'clock now. Do we want to give people a grace minute or two?
Maybe we can do it a little bit.
Wait a little bit. Sure.
Now we got 21 watching.
Oh, okay.
Oh, so it's building rapidly. You have a count, or you both can get counts?
Oh, I think Joe has it.
Oh,
I can check over here.
22 now.
give it another minute.
It's totally up to you.
Okay. Start.
Join. And you're live.
All right. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Patrick Gurian, and I'm covering for Franco Montalto, doing the introductions this week. So welcome to the CC Run Green Infrastructure, Climate and Cities. We've got two speakers. So what we'll do is Malgosia is here with us in person. She will speak first, and then we'll have just brief questions after that. And then after Meri speaks, we'll do a more complete Q&A. And we've got a lot of people online, so thanks very much for joining us online. And we will try not to show too much favoritism towards the in-person people. Zwen will hopefully flag me down during the Q&A and make sure that those of you online get a chance to have your questions answered. So with that, I'd like to move on to the introductions. For both of our speakers, their first task when they come up here will be to correct my pronunciation of their name. So joining us is Malgosia Madajewicz. She is the Associate Research Scientist with the Center for Climate Systems. She's an economist with research expertise in adaptation to climate change, economic development, and evaluation of the effectiveness of programs, policies, and adaptation strategies, including assessing the value of climate information. Much of her research has focused on the role that institutions and networks play in influencing the effectiveness of policies and strategies and the use of value of climate information. She's a member of the research team that comprises the Consortium for Climate Risk in the Urban Northeast, a NOAA-funded regional integrated science and assessment center. She's currently serving as an external member on the community-based adaptation working group of the New York City panel on climate change. She holds a doctorate in economics from Harvard University and has previously served as an assistant professor in the Department of Economics and the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. Welcome, Malgosia.
Thank you very much. If I'd known you were actually going to read that bio, I would have made it half shorter. How do I bring up my... Sorry. Hello, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to give the presentation. I will be talking about the value of climate information. I'm not going to talk about a particular study. Rather, I will summarize the relevant literature and describe 3 pieces of ongoing research that I'm working on at the moment. And this is part of my work with the Consortium for Climate Risk in the Urban Northeast. I'm going to keep referring to that as CC Run throughout the talk. And CC Run, as many of you probably know, is a NOAA-funded RESA program. So the mission of CC Run is to work with decision makers in the urban centers in the Northeast to produce science, climate information, essentially, that can inform decisions, adaptation and risk management decisions that various decision makers in the cities face. Okay, it's not page. Oh, there we go. Okay, just to give you a sense of where I'm going with this, the value of climate information that I'm going to be talking about is in terms of socioeconomic benefits. I'll define what I mean by value of climate information, talk about what some measures of it may be, and then I'll talk about a literature that models value of climate information, and then how we can measure observed rather than model value of climate information, and then I'll conclude. So there may be climate information, so anything you probably all have a set of ideas about what that is, rainfall predictions, temperature predictions, past, present, future, also derived information such as flood predictions. It may have several different types of value. I'm only going to be talking about value that can be measured in terms of socioeconomic benefits of that information. So for example, benefits to farmers from improved yields that they may be able to get by using climate information, improved water reservoir management, management of diseases. There are various examples, more will come up as I'm giving the talk. And also, I'm going to be focusing on quantitative value. Not necessarily in dollar terms, but quantitative. So I'm sort of giving you an economist's perspective on value of climate information. Why am I focused? And by the way, I should say, I welcome questions. You said questions afterwards, but if people don't, as I go through this, if people don't understand something I'm saying and would like things clarified, I welcome questions throughout. I don't know if we can do that with the people who are on the web, but at least with people who are in the room. Anyway, so why am I talking about socioeconomic? Why might we be interested in socioeconomic benefits? Certainly in the current political climate, but pretty much in any political climate, the benefits to society are an important justification for investment of public funding in the development and dissemination of climate information. Understanding benefits can help to prioritize investment towards those information for those contexts where the benefits are higher. Decision makers have to invest effort and possibly money in being able to use climate information. It's not a straightforward exercise. Understanding benefits can help guide their decisions as to where to invest and ability to use what kind of climate information they want to invest in. And finally, understanding benefits is part of the process, can be seen as part of the process of learning how to provide climate information effectively. So you may all be, probably everyone who's listening to me is aware that there has been a long-running discussion on how to provide scientific information for decision-making effectively. So the traditional kind of pipeline approach where universities produce science and that science is available doesn't necessarily result in decision makers using the science that's available. Right? I mean, a generic set of temperature forecasts, for example, might be difficult to use to design a heat health warning system for a city. That information needs to be translated, tailored to particular decisions. That's exactly what CC Run and all the NOAA-funded RESAs around the country do. So it's important for decision makers to be involved in that process. The RESAs try to respond to problems that decision makers raise that they need that climate information for. That process of interaction between decision makers and scientists for providing climate information has been termed co-production, but that term is used to describe a wide variety of types of interaction. And it's a process that can be very time and resource intensive. So we're still in the process of learning, and it's important to identify kind of effective ways of providing climate information for different decision problems under different conditions. And understanding the benefits of providing climate information in various ways is an important part of that process. Hopefully that makes some sense to people. Did I just make sense saying that? Yeah, okay, good. At least I see nodding heads. So what do I mean by value of climate information? It's been defined as the gain from using potentially costly information to choose between different courses of action. So information to choose, for example, between one mitigation pathway versus another mitigation pathway, to choose between putting up a wall to protect a coastline against flooding versus using green infrastructure for that purpose, or you can come up with other examples. The original theoretical formulation was based on expected utility. So the expected utility that can be derived from making a particular decision using the difference between expected utility that can be derived from using climate information for a particular decision versus making that decision without that piece of information. For understanding socioeconomic benefits of climate information, for understanding the value of climate information in terms of socioeconomic benefits, we might want a measure that we understand better than utility. So we might want to be able to value that information in terms of dollars or lives saved or value of infrastructure protected, something that we understand. So I've just given you some of the examples of those measures of benefits that we might be looking for: economic output, increases in economic output valued in dollars, value of protected infrastructure, reduced mortality and morbidity. Those are all potential quantitative measures. Now, which one of those measures should we be using to value climate information in any particular case? It might seem obvious that you want to use those socioeconomic outcomes that are likely to be affected by a particular use of climate information to value the benefits of using that climate information. But that might not be as easy to figure out or as obvious as it might seem. So to take an example from CC Run, one of the big engagements that CC Run has had is to provide various types of climate information, but among them, flood predictions to the city of New York. If you provide flood predictions to the city of New York, what are the outcomes that you would expect to change in terms of which you can figure out the value of that information that you have provided? Well, you might want a somewhat systematic way of trying to figure that out, because it's not obvious what the outcomes that might change are. So, and you have to forgive me for this. I've tried to put up okay, a quick digression before I go into the diagram. This systematic way that I'm about to describe comes from a literature on program evaluation, which is a set of methods that are used to assess effect of policies and programs on socioeconomic outcomes. These methods are used widely to assess social programs such as education, job training, and development programs such as efforts to reduce poverty. They're just beginning to be used in the context of understanding the benefits of climate information. So providing climate information can be viewed as a type of social program, right? Where the RISA program provides climate information services to improve social outcomes. The methods in the program evaluation literature are especially designed precisely to evaluate the effect of such programs. One of the examples of use of those methods that's just starting in this field, not exactly in relation to climate information, but in relation to Earth observations, some of which Earth observations of the environment. So things like observing the extent of green cover versus dry land, or rainfall patterns versus satellite observations. There is a NASA-funded effort housed at the Resources for the Future in Washington, D.C. called Valuables, which has taken on the task of assessing the socioeconomic benefits of Earth observations from satellites. And that's a very similar effort to understanding the value of climate information. So emerging from that program evaluation literature is a systematic method of trying to figure out what are the outcomes that we should be using to measure the value of climate information in a particular case. And what I'm trying to do with this diagram is to, in as simple a way as possible, to model what a program theory does. And I'm terrible with diagrams, so you have to forgive me for this. But what a program theory essentially does is, for climate information provided for a particular use, the program theory would map out how was that climate information developed. Was it developed in collaboration with decision makers? Who were the decision makers who participated? How was it provided to those decision makers in a way that they can understand, in a way that they can trust? As a result of that, who uses it? Who is likely to use that information? For what decisions? And what are those decisions likely to influence? And that should give you the outcomes that you actually want to measure. And you sort of map, you map these things out in a kind of systematic way. So for example, going back to my example of giving coastal flood predictions to the city of New York, through mapping out the program theory, you might identify, well, where is that information likely to go? It is more likely to inform improvements, protection of certain infrastructure against floods, depending on whether the people who are, the agencies that are in charge of that infrastructure are part of the city government and are likely to get that information that's been provided to the city. On the other hand, it's probably not likely to lead to residents of coastal neighborhoods undertaking adaptation actions to protect their houses from floods, because information given to the city is not likely to percolate that way. Or it may, depending on who is at the table, but that's what you would be trying to figure out through this process. What are the outcomes that make sense to look at? Maybe it makes sense to look at what certain protections of infrastructure as a value of that information, but it might not make sense to be looking at the residential level. Once you've identified the outcomes that can measure the value of information, how do you then use them? Where the value of climate information, that net gain that I was talking about before, are essentially outcomes with the new climate information compared to those outcomes in the absence of that new information, something that's called the counterfactual in the literature. Not necessarily something that we can observe. We'll come back to whether we can observe this or not, but it's certainly something that we can model. So let me go into some examples of how we can actually estimate that value of climate information. There's a large literature that uses models to do so. This slide lists the different types of models. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but I'll talk about 3 types very briefly. So I want to move on to assessing, measuring value of climate information, of observed climate information. So this is based on using models. There's a very, by the way, so are there any questions so far? No, everything is perfectly clear? Yeah.
There's an online question.
Yeah.
So some people ask, wouldn't the stakeholder indicate value to them of the climate information provided by the scientist?
Sorry,
wouldn't the stakeholder indicate the value to them of the climate information provided by the scientist?
Yes. So stakeholders might be an important, you would certainly, oops, I'm going the wrong way. You would certainly want to involve stakeholders in developing this idea of what are the outcomes that may change as a result of use of a particular climate information, right? So if you're working with the city of New York, the decision makers that you're working with would be very important participants in the process of figuring out what is going on here and therefore what the outcomes. But this process is actually as useful to stakeholders to figure out what may change as a result of using that information as it is for scientists. This is not necessarily something just for scientists to be doing. It's usually an evaluator actually who puts a lot of people together in a collaborative process to try to figure this out. And it's, yeah. So there's a very large literature that uses crop models coupled with partial equilibrium, economic partial equilibrium models to estimate potential benefits of seasonal forecasts. So the way these models work is the modeler puts a seasonal forecast into the model and decides which decisions farmers can vary or should vary as a result of having those seasonal forecasts. And then the crop model, together with a model of the market, determines what are the benefits to the farmer in terms of increased yields and profits of using those seasonal forecasts to make those particular decisions chosen by the modeler. This has been done in the context of other sectors such as electricity demand or water flow, stream flows. So a model like this is essentially a very detailed program theory. But it's a very detailed program theory of the physical part of the system and the way that the market works. What is not included here, for example, that we had in our program theory slide, is how the way in which that climate information is developed and provided, for example, whether decision makers are participating in that process or not, how they're participating, who is participating, who is at the table. How that's going to affect whether the climate information ever gets used to make those decisions, whether the farmers ever use that information to make the decisions or not, and also how the farmers use information to make those decisions. The modeler imposes that on the model, but there may be what farmers actually do in practice may be quite different from that. So the value of information that you derive from the model may not be, is not likely to be the same as the value that would actually occur in practice in that application. This is important to be able to do. This gives us an idea of how much value that information should have in a more or less ideal scenario. But it's not necessarily a good guide to what is actually, what value society would actually, or the farmers would actually get in a practical application. Another example, and I'll do this more quickly, integrated assessment models couple climate model with a computable general equilibrium. They're often used to assess likely impacts of climate change. They can be used to value improved climate information as an increase in economic output that's possible from changing from one mitigation path to another in response to improved climate information. It's an abstraction from, obviously the model abstracts from the messiness of the way that those decisions are made in reality in a similar way as I discussed for the crop models. And the last type that I'm going to discuss are models that compare damages avoided by with different adaptation strategies. This is, there are quite a few papers that do this for the problem of coastal flooding. So there are papers that compare in a model how much flood damage could be avoided in an area by, say, putting up a physical protection of the coast versus green infrastructure versus protection using green infrastructure, various types of green infrastructure. So just that exercise alone can provide a value of, to the extent those adaptation strategies are chosen based on flood predictions, there's a value of flood predictions that's implied in the reduced cost of damage from implementing one of those adaptation strategies that arises from these models. You can take a step further as this group from the UK do in the context of the Coastal Railroad, where they compare how the choice of adaptation strategies may change if you wait for improved flood predictions. So they compare the choice that would be made with two different sets of flood predictions. So they arrive at something that you can call the auction value of improved information. Is that information worth waiting for given the additional reduction in damages? An important issue that arises in these models is since the value of information here comes from avoided damages, how do we value those avoided damages? Often we don't have very good data on avoided damages. So avoided damages of flooding good data on avoided damages of flooding comes from real estate data, value of real estate. But there's a range of other damages that we don't have good data on. There is a piece of research that I'm working on at the moment that's in this category, where I'm looking at costs that residents of coastal neighborhoods of New York City can avoid through various adaptation strategies, where the value of damage that I'm using comes from a household survey that I did in 2 coastal neighborhoods that were heavily hit by Hurricane Sandy, Rockaways and Staten Island. So I have costs that residents actually incurred, costs of recovery from Hurricane Sandy, that residents actually had to pay out. And since different people had different levels of flooding in their home, I can use those costs to estimate costs that the same households may incur again as a result of future floods, and costs that they can avoid by undertaking some adaptation strategies. Especially because over 80% of households rebuilt after Hurricane Sandy exactly as was before. They didn't build any adaptation towards future flooding into the rebuilding process. So those costs of recovery from Hurricane Sandy can easily be used to value potential reductions in future costs. I'm going to switch gears now to talk about ways that we can estimate observed value of climate information rather than from models. So this is done much less. So are there any questions on what I just talked about? Very quiet group in here. Yeah.
I can't resist. You said 80% rebuilt as before. Is there any kind of economic model as to whether that made sense given the sort of insurance situation where they could get, like, did it make sense from a societal perspective? Did it make sense to them as individual entities given that they could get flood insurance?
So I'll be able to, it's going to vary for different households. Is there an economic model that can speak? I mean, we can figure this out, okay, right? Yeah. I haven't seen it figured out. It's part of what I'm doing as part of that research. Is figuring out under what circumstances those adaptation strategies make sense given the avoided costs. So I suspect that the answer for the most part is no. It did not make sense to do it that way, and it is true that the great majority of residents are not aware of future flood risk. So it's likely that that lack of awareness was part of the reason. There was also, well, okay, I shouldn't go into further details now. I should try to finish. What's been done much less is to estimate observed value of climate information. So going back to this value in terms of comparing outcomes with new climate information to outcomes in the absence of that information. If you want to get at value information that's actually realized in actual applications, you need to be able to observe this counterfactual. This becomes something that you actually need to be able to see in order to do this, to make this comparison, right? But what we generally, what we observe when we use climate information for particular decision problems are outcomes of information that's been developed and distributed and used in a particular way. If you compare that to another instance in which there is no information or less information, say you compare that to an instance in which there is no information. So you look at a group of coastal residents who have been given climate information, developed and disseminated somehow, that they can now use to make adaptation decisions. And you compare them to a group of coastal residents who have no climate information, or have worse climate information, whichever you prefer. In the first case, if they have no climate information, that comparison is giving you the value of climate information developed and provided in whatever way it was done for those residents. Remember, we talked about co-production, is whether the potential value of co-producing climate information versus kind of a pipeline approach. Well, that value, the value to those residents of the adaptation options that they may take using that information that was provided to them is going to depend on how that information was provided, because that may very well affect whether or not they use the information and how they use it. Does that make sense? So the value that you observed, reduction in their flood damages in the future as a result of their adaptation actions, depends on how that climate information was provided to them. So the value kind of depends on the whole package of things, how the information was provided, how it was used. Whereas in the other case, if there's no information, then that comparison is giving you the value of that entire package, right? That reasonably clear? No? Tell me if it's not. So that's kind of, okay, so this might
understand. So would you do some sort of a gradient comparison of 2 or 3 different types of ways of providing information versus someone who hasn't gotten any information at all?
So let me, the best way to address that, and I think what's going to make this clear, is for me to jump to examples, because examples will make it clearer. So let me skip this slide for a minute. I'm going to talk about this in the context of the examples. So there are 3 examples of research that I'm working on. One of them is looking at the effects of weathered index insurance on livelihoods of smallholders in Ethiopia. This is actually done. This is something I've already done. The intent of this was not to look at the value of information, but I think it serves as an example. So weather index insurance pays out to farmers based on weather outcomes. For example, so farmers may get a payment if rainfall is below a certain amount, and therefore there's a threat of drought, or there was a drought. It's not based on yields, it's based on a weather outcome. So it depends critically on, in this case, the risk is drought, so the index depends on whether or not, on the probability of drought. In order to create the index, it's essential to have a good climatology of rainfall. So there is a value, so the value of climate information, the value of this rainfall climatology here is built into the index insurance. It's not, there isn't a value of it. It's not going to be valuable to just provide a rainfall climatology to the farmers, right? We don't want to communicate that information directly. It's built into the weather index insurance. So the only way that you can get at the value, potential value of that information, is to figure out what is the value of the weather index insurance to the farmers. So that's a package. That's not just the information itself. That's a way that the information has been packaged that you're getting at the value of, right? So the challenge that you have here is a challenge that you have anytime you're evaluating any kind of a program, which is how do you figure out, how do you attribute differences in outcomes to weather index insurance as opposed to other things that may differ between the cases that you're comparing. So just to give you an example of how a problem like that can be addressed, and this is a piece of methodology that comes out of the program evaluation literature, this would actually be a nice case for a field experiment, but I didn't have the resources to do an experiment. So what I did here, I collected data on farmers in villages where weather index insurance was offered and villages in which weather index insurance was not offered. Okay, so my comparison here, my counterfactual, are villages in which weather index insurance is not offered. That's the case without the information. That's my comparison, right? And I collected data on the same farmers before the weather index insurance was offered and after. There could be any number of differences between the villages with the weather index insurance and the villages without the weather index insurance. This is not a case of observing a perfect counterfactual. But can I derive from this the value of the weather index insurance? Yes, if the villages without the weather index insurance are chosen in such a way that they have the same sort of cropping conditions, they have the same climate outcomes, same environmental conditions as the villages that get the weather index insurance. They have similar socioeconomic characteristics. They get the same programs that might affect outcomes of interest as the villages that don't get the weather index insurance, right? So how might I measure the value of the weather index insurance? One measure of value might be in terms of number of oxen that farmers have. Oxen are their most important assets. Just to make this more concrete, oxen are their most important assets. Why would weather index insurance affect the holding of that asset? Because the way that farmers often cope with drought is they sell their oxen, which has disastrous consequences for their ability to grow crops after the drought. So weather index insurance with the insurance payout might help them hold on to their oxen instead of selling them. So that's a measure of the value of the weather index insurance, is the number of oxen that a farmer can keep. So if I compare, so there are other programs and other outcomes that farmers might be getting that might affect their ability to hold on to their oxen. As long as all those programs are the same in the villages that get the weather index insurance and the villages that don't, then by comparing the change over time in the number of oxen that farmers have between those two sets of villages, I can get at one measure of value of the weather index insurance. Does that make sense? And does that kind of answer your question? Yeah.
How can they save more oxen than they have on average?
No, they simply, they don't save more than they have. They simply don't sell them in case of a drought. What the weather index insurance allows them to do is to not sell them in case of a drought.
But it
So,
says that they lost 1.5 fewer when they only owned one.
this is on average. On average, farmers own about one oxen. The comparison between in the comparison, so some farmers own more than that, some farmers own fewer than that. In the comparison between villages with weather index insurance and villages without weather index insurance, the difference in the average difference, the farmers who own more oxen than more than one oxen are going to also lose more oxen, potentially lose more oxen in a drought, right? So the change over time can easily be more than the average amount owned at a particular point in time. So that's an example of how, so that's one example of getting at the value of climate information that's packaged together. An example of getting at the value of climate information, but what you have to be aware of is that by trying to get at the observed value, you're getting at the value of a package of interventions rather than the climate information itself. I think, how late did we start? I'm just trying to think if I should go through. I don't want to go on for too long. Should I do one more example? Yeah, let me just do one more example. Let me do not this one, but the next one. I'll do one more example. And then I'll want to wrap up. So this is looking at the effect of, this is looking more directly at climate information. So the effect of flood predictions on adaptation to coastal flooding among urban residents. So you might want to, if you provide flood, I told you before that this is in the context of the research I mentioned before, where I did household surveys in 2 areas affected by Hurricane Sandy. And I told you that, that residents, for the most part, are not aware of the future risk of flooding. You might wonder, what is the potential value in this context of offering information about flood predictions to residents so that they can actually take some adaptation strategies? And what is the comparison that you would want to carry out in order to get at that value? So this is work that I haven't, this is actually an example out of a proposal that I have submitted. This is not work that I've completed, so I can't give you a value. I'm just using this as an example of how you would set up, a problem. So what I propose to do is to compare 3 groups of residents. One, and let me just clarify, the value, the potential value of climate information here is coming from the ability to take adaptation actions that may reduce future cost of flooding, right? So it's the reduction in the future cost of flooding to the household that's the value that you're getting at, and you can put a monetary value on that. I propose to compare 3 groups. Residents who would participate in workshops in which we would work through future risk of flooding and various adaptation options that residents could implement in kind of a co-production process where scientists and residents and community groups would work through this information together to figure out how it could be useful to residents, what they could actually do with that information. We'd go through costs and benefits of various adaptation actions to kind of guide decision making. Similar information on current risk of flooding, not future, but current, as well as potential adaptation actions, is available online. It's something that's been developed by the City of New York. It's available online. A lot of people are not aware of it. So a kind of intermediate group would participate in workshops in which we would provide the future risk of flooding, not just current, but also future. But we would just make people aware of that information about adaptation options that's available online. We wouldn't actually work through it in that co-production process. So this illustrates a challenge in identifying the value of climate information. What are you going to get out of this comparison? You get a value of future flood predictions offered through this co-production process and together with an analysis of potential adaptation options, the value of that entire package compared to some of that being available online, so through a very different provision process, or more or less that same information, but available mainly online, again, without really the co-production piece. Right? Those are kind of the three pieces of information, the three pieces of value that you can compare here. If you wanted to have a very clean identification of the value of future costs, of the value of future risk of flooding, this is not exactly what you would want to do. You would want to have two groups to which you provide the same information, to which you provide the information in the same way, but one gets only information about current risk of flooding, and the other one gets information about current risk of flooding plus future risk of flooding. That would give you the value of the future risk of flooding. Here, that value is packaged with the way that you're providing the information, that co-production process. That this group is getting, but the other two groups really aren't getting. It's of great interest to decision making, but it illustrates the trouble of identifying value of climate information, of observed climate information in actual situations where you need to decide whether you want to separate that value of the information itself from the way in which it's been provided and the way in which it is used, or whether you're just interested in the value of the entire package altogether. Hopefully that makes some sense to people. And then I'm going to skip this slide and just go to my conclusion, where you may have noticed that in the models, we had a very detailed model of the physical part of the world, but we weren't really modeling how the way that information is provided and the way that people make decisions might affect the value of climate information. When you're looking at observed value of climate information, what we can actually get in the real world, much of the uncertainty about that comes from the way that society handles decision making, which is what we are actually able to observe when we compare outcomes in particular applications in which we provide climate information. We can improve our understanding of the role that decision-making plays with a greater reliance on agent-based models, which are used in this context very much at the moment. But we also need more research on observed value of climate information, which makes a lot more progress on kind of disentangling value of climate information from the way in which it is provided, so that we can learn about ways to provide it effectively. And that value will be different for different decision problems under different conditions for different populations. So the remaining challenge is how we can, if we have studies in different contexts that assess the value of climate information for different decision problems in different contexts, can we then aggregate those values from those particular studies into some broader understanding of what the value is in particular sectors? Thank you.
All right, thanks so much. So, we can pause here for a quick question. I don't know if there's anything online, Zealand.
There are two questions online. Well, there's a quick question. People ask, can you share the slides? And then there are two questions. One is, people ask that you have a reference paper about CC and street flow project. And people ask if you can provide the full reference for it.
About which one?
Is it CC and stream flow?
Climate, yeah, I know that CC is climate change, but stream flow would, it was probably one of the papers that I was citing on the model. Yes, I can provide the full reference for all of those.
Another one is, so on seasonal crop forecast, climate information, or long-range weather forecast, can you just discuss the time frame between these two?
So I don't know that I'm the best person to make that assessment. You can consider them, I've heard them considered both. At the International Research Institute for Climate and Society, where they work a lot on seasonal climate forecasts, people talk about that, or these long range, they're discussed more often as climate forecasts than as long-term weather forecasts. So IRI considers it climate information. It presents it as climate information to decision makers. But I'm not a climate scientist, so I'm perhaps not the best person to address that question.
All right. Thank you. So I don't know if there are any logistics we need to do to pass control to Meri so that she can present herself. Okay, great. All right, so while we're at this technical interlude, I'll go ahead with the introduction. We're very pleased to have Meri Davlasheridze, Assistant Professor at Texas A&M University at Galveston, join us this afternoon. She has a bachelor's degree in economics from Tbilisi State University.
Looks good.
All right. Republic of Georgia, she has a Master's of Science in Agriculture and Economics from Texas A&M University, and a PhD in Agricultural, Environmental, and Regional Economics from Pennsylvania State. She's an Assistant Professor of Environmental and Resource Economics at Texas A&M University at Galveston, and a Faculty Research Fellow at the Center for Texas Beaches and Shores. She is involved in the Interdisciplinary Research Program of Integrated Assessment Model Development, Diagnostics, and Intermodal Comparisons, funded by Department of Energy and led by directors at Penn State and Stanford. Her research interests include economic impacts of climate-induced natural disasters, public policy concerning disaster mitigation and recovery issues. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and it's a great pleasure to present one of the papers that was published at the Journal of Environmental Economics and Management. It's about the efficacy of the different types of adaptation measures and the programs that FEMA funds after major disasters, and we'll look at these investments and we'll look at their returns in terms of avoided disaster damages. So this is a brief outline of my talk. I'll briefly talk about the motivation, then the research question of this paper, data and the empirical approach, and of course I'll present the results and some policy implications with the concluding remarks, and I'll try to tie this to the climate information and the information provision in general and how we can improve upon those and infer this value from indirectly using some of the approaches that we adopt in this paper. So the motivation for this research is that we see that natural disasters are becoming increasingly costly, so economic and the social costs are rising. And since 1980s, for example, the United States has experienced more than 219 weather and climatic disasters, and amounting in over 1.5 trillion in accumulated losses. And we know that 2017 was one of the hardest in terms of the billion-dollar events. And Harvey and Irma and Maria, all of these have accounted around 87% of the losses. And when, of course, these types of the extreme events happen, we know that they most of the times overwhelm local capacities to address the consequences of the disasters. And we see, at least in the context of the United States, that the federal government plays a major role in coordinating emergency response, recovery, and providing some financial assistance to states and the local counties, cities, and the communities to recover from them, from the disasters. And from the social perspective, it's very costly to address these consequences in the aftermath, because we cannot really change much if we do not undertake proactively these mitigating measures before the disasters and the events happen. And some of the estimated figures since 2004, including 2013, it has cost over $300 billion in direct losses to address the consequences of weather extreme events in the United States. So one thing is that we see that the consequences are tremendous, but there is also an opportunity after the disaster, that because people update sort of a risk perception about the risk, and disaster also is sort of a more salient, and they could encourage, these types of events could encourage some sort of a private adaptation behavior. We might see that people rebuild more resilient, may use these insurance payouts or the loans that they get from Small Business Administration to build more resilient homes for the future incidents, right? It also provides windows of opportunity for local communities at the public level to make some institutional change in terms of the land use planning and the zoning and things like that. Also, the research shows that disasters could induce the updating in technologies for the future to mitigate the future impact and encourage some risk mitigating investments. So there are some good sides of the disaster incidents, but at the same time, when there is this ex-post disaster aid or the anticipation that there would be some help from the federal government or a third party, this could also provide some sort of a perverse incentives for ex-ante risk mitigation behavior. In particular, when we talk about the private adaptation, for example, how much individuals, homeowners, or the businesses could adapt before the disaster happened, if they anticipate that there is a third party, such as a government, to bail them out, they will probably limit their adaptation behavior. And economists call this notion the Samaritan's dilemma, or the charity of moral hazard problem, that we see that people limit their mitigation behavior or adaptation behavior in anticipation of the bailout or the help. And the third one is that sometimes this government assistance can be perceived as a substitute for the private self-insurance or self-protection behavior, because you may think that there is lots of public spending on disaster mitigation, such as investment in the levees or the seawalls or some other coastal spines. This might sort of create this false sense of security that your home or your community is protected, so you do not necessarily have to do anything, for example, to buy the flood insurance or to elevate the house, install the gutters and things like that. So how we can learn from the different types of the adaptation or public programs, and also learn how they interfere or interact with the private adaptation decision. So in this particular paper, we are interested what is the relative effectiveness of the public disaster programs on reducing hurricane-induced property losses, and we specifically focus on the North Atlantic hurricanes, and if there is any potential gains from diversifying resources across the programs, because these programs are funding the different types of the variety of programs, and some have the long-term components on it in terms of the mitigating the hazard risks in the future, while others are more proactive, more responsive and targeting the recovery and quick rebound of the local communities. And in particular, we focus on two primary federal programs that are funded in the United States for the public projects. And one is called the Hazard Mitigation Grants Program, and another is a public assistance program. And I will briefly talk about some of the details about these programs. But before that, the maintained hypothesis in this paper is that we expect that these programs to be very effective on reducing the property losses. However, their effectiveness could be diminished or somehow interfered with how much individuals or the private homeowners perceive these adaptation measures are. Are they treating them as substitute for their adaptive behavior, or do they feel that they're secure so that they can rebuild the homes to the pre-disaster level, so do not improve much? Or some of these measures could also depend on the severity of the hazards. For example, if there is levees and the dikes and all these types of the structural investments that provide the protection from flood control protections, have their engineering designs. They cannot withstand, for example, if there is a levee that can withstand hurricane category 3, they cannot withstand if there is more severe hurricane hitting the area. So their protective efficiency may diminish depending on the severity of hazard. So we are interested in understanding these mechanisms in this paper. So we, as I mentioned, the federal disaster programs are stipulated from the federal government, and it's established under the framework of the Robert Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act of 1988. Basically, when this, what this framework does, it sort of creates a guidelines. If there is an extreme event which overwhelms states and the local resources to respond to the consequences, the state governor writes a letter or the request to the president to issue the disaster declaration. And then president has this sole discretion to determine whether to declare a disaster or not. And after president declares a disaster or the emergency, then it authorizes the Federal Emergency Management Agency to allocate certain disaster recovery money to help these impacted communities recover from the consequences of the disasters. And in the United States, at least, why do we care about these public disaster programs is that it's very reactive in nature. We see that disaster has to be declared in order to authorize the federal public spending on these types of the projects. And when the process works in a way that it's very time constrained and not much time to really evaluate effectiveness of the different types of the programs. These types of the projects that are funded typically are not scrutinized vigorously, and estimating their effectiveness in terms of the benefits and the costs are not done as comprehensively as on the other projects, where you have a lot of time, you can compare different alternatives of the projects and make very informed decision which projects to choose based on the benefits and the cost calculation. And of course, there is some sort of a misalignment and mismatch of the interests of the relevant stakeholders, because sometimes there is a question of the shared responsibilities in who is responsible for managing the disaster risks. So this is not fully accounted in the management of the disaster programs when it's very reactive in nature. Also in the research, previous research that has been published in this line of the literature suggests that some of the post-disaster aid could be politically motivated, because there are two avenues of the political influence. One, that president has sole discretion to declare a disaster. And sometimes they show that during the election years, presidential election years, there is more frequent disaster declaration than in other years. Sometimes disasters are declared in areas which are more important politically for the president. And so is the allocation of the disaster money that FEMA has the oversight from the federal government, and some committees, and if the states are represented in those committees, could influence the decision how much money to be allocated for the impacted states and the localities. So there are sort of disadvantages and advantages of this post-disaster or reactive disaster management. One is that some of the retrofits and the other hazard mitigation measures are more cost-effective to incorporate on already destroyed assets rather than otherwise sound structures pre-disaster, which sort of provides a window of opportunity for local governments or even private individuals to really improve and make their houses hazard-proof. And also the interest in the risk management is more salient after the disaster, because this information is very fresh, and there is a lot of concern to avoid it in the future. However, literature also shows that the disaster memory does not really last long. So on average, 5 to 7 years, it actually disappears. So I think right after disaster, it's a good time for us to think proactively how to mitigate the future consequences of the future events. However, disadvantages are that funds are exclusively allocated to affected communities, at least the funds that come from the federal government. And if we believe that the climate change is going to alter the spatial distribution of the impacts, then those counties or the localities that were near miss of these events essentially do not have the access to these resources than those that have been experiencing these disasters more frequently. And funds are obtained typically via emergency supplementary appropriations on an ad hoc basis, and they do not go, as I mentioned, through a rigorous scrutiny on the cost effectiveness, and are spent in a more chaotic post-disaster environment, and it's very difficult to really evaluate their effectiveness in terms of the rightness of spending. And in the United States, at least the current political climate is that there is not much interest in changing the current disaster management. And if we are going to live with the current model, then we really need to know how effective these post-disaster programs are, and this is what the purpose of this paper is. And as I mentioned, we focus on the two types of programs. One is a public assistance program of FEMA, which is one of the largest funded public projects, and they typically fund two types of the projects. One are emergency response projects, such as debris removal, emergency protective measures, such as sandbags and windows boardings and things like that, shelters and so on and so forth. And another types of the projects that are funded are permanent public works, which include restoration and repair of the public infrastructure, such as roads, bridges, utility lifelines, to help these localities to rebound back to the normal life as quickly as possible. And the second type of the project that we focus on is called Hazard Mitigation Grants Program. They primarily target these long-term mitigation programs in order to reduce the future risk of flooding or the disaster, and typically focus on types of the activities such as acquisition of land, buyouts, demolition and relocation and things like that, as well as elevation of some of the damaged structure, implementation of the hazard mitigation planning, hazard identification. Structure is that 75% of the federal money is allocated for these programs, but the 25% should be matched locally by the states, or the local counties or the cities should have this matching. The current budget allocation of the FEMA is at not more than 15% of the total grant expenditures of the FEMA could be allocated for the hazard mitigation grants program, even though we acknowledge the long-term mitigation advantage of these types of the activities. Okay, so to understand this problem, we are trying to sort of see their effectiveness in terms of mitigating property losses. And so we estimate this panel data and using the Tobit model. And Tobit model is appropriate when we have lots of zeros in our dependent variable and some positive values. And the zeros could be either censored because some of the losses that are less than some threshold are not reported typically, or could be just a natural outcome that there was no disaster, or there was no disaster but there was a disaster but it did not cause losses. So our dependent variable is the property losses per capita, and we are interested in understanding how these losses are mitigated in response to the increased FEMA spending on the hazard mitigation programs, which we called ex-ante programs, even though they are given after major disaster declaration, but they serve these long-term mitigation purposes. And the second one is the FEMA ex-post program, which are the types of the public projects which are primarily for recovery and cleanup activities. And we also account for the different types of the determinants of the damages, in particular physical exposure to hazards measured by the cumulative number of hurricane hits, and the other types of the disaster declarations, and whether the county is coastal or not, as well as the economic exposure, such as income or wealth, change in population and businesses and things like that. We also account for the infrastructure vulnerabilities, such as what is the number of the vulnerable housing stocks, specifically the houses that were built before 1940s and the mobile homes. Also, we account for how well some of the building codes are enforced in these areas. So this is our sample. We cover the period of 1989 till 2009, and the number of the counties that are included in our sample are 651. And these are the counties that have experienced at least one hurricane, or experience the damages from at least one hurricanes during this time period. So we have many ones which are darker red shades that have experienced lots of damages from during this period from the hurricanes. So one of the main challenge to estimate the effectiveness of various programs on the damages that target damage reduction is to identify their exogenous effect on the damages, because we know that FEMA spending is determined by damages, and damages are also affected by how much public mitigation spending was historically done, or what are the expectations of these types of the program spending in the future. This is a very typical problem that's called the endogeneity in economics, and without addressing this one, we may bias our estimated effects of FEMA programs on damages. So this is a big challenge that has been addressed in many papers, and our advantage, or the sort of way out of this potential endogeneity, is that we decide to use this politics of the disaster. So we said that, okay, we believe that FEMA operates, or operation or allocation of the disaster spending is somewhat politically mitigated or motivated, we can use these political variables to understand how much it affects the spending on the FEMA programs, and then through this channel we can identify what is the effect of the FEMA program exogenously, controlling for other control variables on disaster damages. So we choose this it's called instrumental variables. We choose three types of the instrumental variables. One is the percent voting for independent candidates in the most recent presidential election. This is sort of based on the swing voter theory, which postulates that there are undecided voters who may be willing to compromise their loyalty for the favorite party in exchange for the economic benefits. So there is always sort of incentives for these candidates to target those undecided voters and make these promises that they would grant more disaster declaration, or will give them more money if they believe that this might sway their decision in the elections. So these sort of independent voters have been primary targets of presidential candidates during the election. So this is one avenue of the politics influence on the disaster that comes from the president, because president has the sole discretion to declare a disaster. Second avenue of the political influence of the disaster declaration and the allocation of the FEMA money comes from the oversight committees of the FEMA, and these are the Stafford and non-Stafford committees that are responsible for overseeing the FEMA operation related to disasters and some other non-disaster related programs. So we create sort of an indicator variable which equals 1 if the states have the representatives in one of those committees and subcommittees. So if you have the representative, it's more likely that you would persuade the committee to allocate more money for certain types of the disaster programs. And the third types of the political instruments that we use is again the indicator variable equals 1 if the Senate state majority elections is exactly the same as the party of the incumbent president. So if the states and the national or political parties are in line, that they are more likely to pursue the same agenda than otherwise. So this is so basically we estimate these first stage results where we are interested in how these political instruments affect the federal programs. And we see that if the states are represented in Stafford and non-Stafford committees, this increases the spending of the money on FEMA programs that are targeting the long-term hazard mitigations or ex-ante programs, as well as those that target recovery program activities. And as far as the swing voter hypothesis, we see that more independent voters in a county, they receive the higher FEMA money on the long-term mitigation programs. And the third one also, whether the Senate and the presidents have the same party, also affects the allocation of the long-term mitigation programs more than it has an effect on the recovery funds. So we identify this channel, and from this channel then we are interested how these FEMA programs affect the disaster damages. So these are the results of this model, and I just highlight here in bold the FEMA program spending, and the dependent variable is a per capita loss, and these negative signs and the significance which are indicated by stars indicate that increased spending on these FEMA projects, whether it's targeting the long-term mitigation or the recovery types of the activities, are both very effective in mitigating losses. However, the long-term mitigation programs, as anticipated, have higher return in terms of the investment in these types of activities. And specific returns that we calculated in terms of the elasticity is that if you increase FEMA spending on the long-term mitigation programs by 1%, then the property values losses will be reduced by 0.20, approximately 21% if the damages are positive, a little bit less if we consider some damages. Some counties may not experience losses while the others experience losses. And the recovery programs have this sort of elasticity estimated around 0.12%. So the long-term mitigation programs are twice as effective as the recovery programs, even though we see that historically there has been disproportionately a lot of money allocated on the recovery programs than on the long-term mitigation grants. I'm going to skip this slide and just highlight briefly these major findings. What we found is that economic exposure or the wealth is a primary driver for property losses. Vulnerable infrastructure also exacerbates losses. We find that at the margin, returns in terms of the property loss reduction is higher for ex-ante long-term mitigation programs relative to the ex-post, but nonetheless, these ex-post programs are very effective. And there could be an efficiency gain if there is more money reallocated for ex-ante programs. And we did some simple exercise using Hurricane Sandy, and we just showed that if you increase the spending, if only 16% extra of the money was reallocated from the public assistance to the hazard mitigation programs, significant amount of the losses could be mitigated from this event. So the question here then remains, what can we talk about using these public programs? Can we talk about something, private adaptation behavior, or make some inference about the public adaptation behavior? So do they perceive these programs as substitutes, for example, or they pursue them as complements to their adaptive behavior? For example, some of the FEMA ex-ante projects that are funded from hazard mitigation grants are stormwater management, improvement in levee structures and things like that. One can argue that this could be pursued as a substitute to private adaptation behavior, but we still see that whatever the perverse impact incentives they may provide for private adaptations, their direct effects on reducing property losses dominate these perverse incentives. Second types of the projects that are funded by these programs are the demolition of the private and public structures, buyouts and things like that, which naturally imply less exposure from future hazards. So that obviously would reduce the losses. And the third types, which are very important ones, are hazard identification and warning systems, which are primarily targeting on the information. And the whole idea is that how much this information is, whether this information is effectively communicated to the private individuals or not, and whether this incentivizes their adaptive behavior. For example, to install gutters, upgrade roofs, windows, and things like that. And as far as the FEMA ex-post programs, some of the activities target the cleanup of the debris, such as cutting down the trees and things like that, which obviously would serve as a substitute for private adaptive behavior. Other types of the activities are cleaning the clogged sewage system, ditches, and drainage systems, which are effective because they improve the functionality of these systems from the future events. And the third types are the restoration of the public utilities, roads, buildings, and public structures, which do not necessarily help to mitigate losses, but they help to help these individuals and the private businesses to return back to their communities and rebuild on their own devices and rebuild faster. So could potentially mitigate or complement their hazard mitigation behavior. So in order to disentangle these types of the effects, or what are the primary programs that could potentially drive our effects, we estimated this model specifically separating these different types of activities for the ex-post programs and for ex-ante programs. And so we estimated, for example, 6 different types of the models in which we included either mitigation 1, which is hazard identification and planning programs, or only acquisition and reallocation types of programs, and so on and so forth, and assuming that ex-post program will stay as it is. And I'm going to present just results from this exercise, and what it shows that only mitigation 2 and mitigation 6 activities are very effective or statistically significant, highly significant. And these types of activities, mitigation 2 targets acquisition of the property and relocation and elevation or the retrofit of the structures. And importantly, the second type that is very important and has a largest return in terms of the dollar investment is a warning and forecasting system, which actually suggests that private individuals do undertake some of the private adaptation measures to mitigate losses, which is communicated through these warning systems. And we can sort of value this value of this information, or the climate information or the hazard information from these types of the warning system, how effective they are in reducing losses. As far as the types of the ex post or the recovery programs, the most important ones are the restoration of the public utilities, these bridges, access and roads. And second, the most important ones were cleanup and debris removal programs. So the first types of the activities, as I've highlighted, do not necessarily mitigate losses, but rather facilitate recovery and return of the private residents, which again suggests that private individuals do engage in expensive adaptive behavior to mitigate the losses from future incidents. So just some concluding remarks. Historically, as I've highlighted throughout this presentation, recovery and assistance in the aftermath has been the predominant strategy in the United States to manage the hazard risk. Only 15% of the total FEMA budget could be allocated for the long-term mitigation programs. Projections show that there could be an increased frequency in the North Atlantic hurricanes, and with magnified economic losses. And of course, the strategy that is solely focused on the ex-post recovery could be very costly socially. And redirecting this FEMA spending on the hazard awareness and the warning systems in particular has a significant way to improve the efficacy of some of these programs. However, we want also to highlight that there is a significant benefit on the recovery programs and the timely response, because it facilitates private return behavior and encourages their private adaptation response as well. And this is all I have for today. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks very much. So we do have some time for questions, and again, for either Meri or Malgosia, and I don't know if there's anything online. Okay. So I have a quick question for Meri, which is just, you pointed out, I believe, that there's evidence that these sorts of warning systems do spur private investments in disaster mitigation. Is there any literature out there, any way to get insight into how effective the private funds are? I mean, I think you've shown that the public funds are effective. What about on the private side? I mean, I guess this is sort of a backdoor into suggesting that they are effective. Is there any?
Yeah, that's a backdoor thing that suggests that behavior. However, there is very limited research that indicates what types of adaptive behavior they may engage in. Sometimes they just may buy the insurance because this is one of the requirements to receive the disaster aid, or the requirements to apply for the Small Business Administration disaster loans. And of course, purchasing the insurance does not mitigate the amount of the losses they might experience, but rather transferring the risk to the third party and paying for this risk. But in the US, this flood insurance was also very subsidized, so the price do not necessarily reflect the actuarial risk. So that's another social cost that might be there. But I have one ongoing research where we show that the Small Business Administration loans are more effective, for example, even when we control that individuals could undertake, could buy the flood insurance, which could suggest that they may be improving more than just rebuilding to the pre-disaster level. For example, assistance that they get in terms of the grants from federal government to rebuild the houses, they are not required necessarily to rebuild the house resilient, but to bring the house to a livable condition, which does not necessarily mitigate the losses from future events. But business loans, which are the loans and it's a responsibility to repair actually motivates more mitigation behavior than the assistance or the grants. This is what the research shows, at least.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Questions? Anything online? All right, well then, yes.
I'll ask a question. Do you think that one of the reasons that the ex-ante, you find bigger effects of the ex-ante programs is because the ex-ante FEMA programs are more complementary, with maybe more, they may have more of a complementary effect with private actions, particularly if you think about storm warnings and that some of those FEMA programs are storm warnings and assistance with relocation. Whereas the ex-post programs are the ones that are, there's a bigger substitution effect.
Could be that mechanism that determines the higher return on ex-ante programs that obviously, or at least our research shows that the returns on the warning and forecasting is the highest, and this is where we see the most effects of the ex-ante programs coming from. It's warning systems and the buyouts or the retrofits. These are actually the two types of the activities that are mostly funded also from hazard mitigation grants. And could be that they are, I mean, at least the buyouts are could be considered as a complementary, and the warning, of course, would be complementary because you have the warning in advance and you may board your windows, you may put the sandbags around the house. So there is a lots of small mitigation that individuals can undertake, not even retrofitting structurally their houses to mitigate the losses.
All right, so thank you, and please join me in thanking our speakers.
Thank you.
Thanks again for joining us, Meri.
Thank you very much for your invitation.
Oh, okay, so you can't see who.
Oh, unless people ask questions, I can see them. I cannot tell who is
Yeah. No, I had to be really anyway, so
But we have to work online.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's fine. Be interesting to see who actually is choosing it. Why don't you for sure? Yeah, no problem. Thank you. What you're saying a little better to what it is that people are maybe interested in, we'll be able to understand. I mean, I started realizing about halfway through that I was just paying way too much in, and that I needed to like slow down. People were probably recognize what I was saying.
I could touch with CC, but the workshops are something that I really want to try to engage with.
What do you work with?
I'm doing a study on water quality in buildings, and then I Are you familiar with the town and gown programs in New York City? Okay, they, New York City municipal government issues these RFPs, and supposedly this master agreement, and they just issue like task orders. So it's supposed to be no hassles. And we're trying to do the first ever town and gown agreement with Drexel, and it's just taking all my time to try and get this thing to work because the city is not.
So much for no hassle.
No, they are not a research sponsoring agency. They are used to contractors. They're used to vendors.
I'm going to pick up here.
Okay.
Sure,
Yeah,
sure.
but
Thanks,
Thank you for
thanks
coming.
for your help
Great,
with
thank you
this.
for your presentation. I should have contacted beforehand.
No
Make
worries at
sure all the
all.
mention,
No.
okay.
I mean, as I said, I was coming in earlier anyway.
All right.
to
Well,
talk about
just send me the receipt so I can have you.
Sure, sure.
Right. Thanks again.
it. Okay.
All right. Thanks a lot. Yeah, so kind of the stuff we're trying to get in their vendor system. So, but anyway, that goes.
And that's to look at, that's to look at what you were saying, the water quality.
No, actually, that's to look at pathways to 80 by 50. So that would,
Sorry?
pathways to 80% carbon, greenhouse gas emissions reductions by 2050. So if that happens, I would do business for a year, but
Okay.
it's not clear that it's going to happen. Yeah. So anyway, so you're doing this ICC right?
I, two things.
Okay.
There are a lot of